My name is Mandy Morland, and thank you for coming to my GDC talk, The Subtle Art of Not Making VFX. During your time here at this virtual GDC, there will be plenty of presentations you can go to about, new techniques or new hardware, new software that will push the industry forward. But during my presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about skills that you can develop specifically as VFX artist that will, last you for years to come. They'll be just as useful 10 years from now as they are today. Before we dive into that, a little bit about myself. As I said, my name is Mandy Morland. I use she, her pronouns. And for those that don't see me or can't see me, I'm a white woman with dark brown hair, brown eyes, and I'm wearing a green sweater today. I was born and raised in Orlando, Florida. I got my bachelor's in physics from Florida State University and continued my education and got my master's of fine arts in digital production arts from Clemson University. I began my career as a VFX artist in animated films before transitioning in 2015 to games, where I've been working since at the Coalition. During my tenure here, I've worked on Gears of War 4, Gears 5, Gears Tactics, and our recent released Hivebusters DLC. And across all of these, I've primarily worked on level VFX, but I've also dabbled in multiplayer and in cinematic VFX as well. So what are we going to talk about today? As I sort of preface, this talk will dig into what some people call soft skills, but skills that you can kind of take with you as a VFX artist that won't, ever be outdated or overwritten. They are skills that you can, continue to grow and that will make you as an artist and a developer, a better person as well. So we're going to talk about this in two sort of categories. And the first is going to be this idea of building intention in the workplace. And this is sometimes called mindfulness, building mindfulness in the workplace, but I prefer the word intention, and we'll discuss a little bit why. And then we're going to talk about how to own and embrace failure. So first, when we talk about building intention in the workplace, what I mean by this is being conscious of the actions you make and doing so intentionally, the decisions you make, doing so with intention. And primarily this idea of working with empathy. And what I mean when I say this is seeing your fellow coworker as a valuable human being also in this cycle with you, and being cognizant of how your actions can affect them and their actions can affect you, and having empathy for them. We're going to do this by talking about how to build communication within your team and across other disciplines, and also how to foster collaboration between, your team and other disciplines. And then second, we're going to dig into this idea of failure, and specifically how to embrace it. We're going to talk about why we might be afraid of failure. And then we're going to learn how we can kind of change our mindset about it to use it to our advantage instead. Now, you might be asking yourself, why does any of this even matter? I'm a VFX artist or I'm a game developer. All that matters is I do my job, and at the end of the day, the game gets shipped. But I think the clearest example of why this matters is if we look at, what a production pipeline actually looks like. So in an ideal world, your production might look something like this. You start out in the ideation or concept phase. These sort of bounce back and forth. You have an idea for a game. It goes into concept. It gets fleshed out a little bit and shaken out. And then when it feels like that idea has strong enough legs to stand on, then it moves into this block-in and design phase. This is where you will design like your animation, your mechanics, your systems, your combat or your gameplay. Maybe you block in your levels at this point in time. But eventually you feel like, okay, this is good. We have an idea that's working. It feels great. Feels like it has a lot of potential. And then you move into sort of the fleshing out phase. You send it to level art, and environment starts building, your sets and modeling either characters or, the set pieces and the worlds that you're going to be playing in. And then when, that's all done and people love it, and because this is perfect in an ideal world, you've hit all your deadlines. It goes into sort of the art phase, the meat and potatoes phase of lighting, VFX, and audio. You light your levels and they're beautiful. You add VFX to the weapons or the characters or the monsters. You add audio in, and everything's great. Everybody's happy. It's a perfect game. Everything's shaping up right on time. It goes into QA, and because you did everything perfectly up to this point, QA tells you there's no bugs, or maybe there's just a few bugs, but they're super easy to fix. And eventually you pass your game off to cert, and then you ship. Now, if there's any producers in the audience, or really anybody who's worked on a production ever, you know that this isn't even remotely close to what happens. This is the ideal. This is what everybody wants it to be, but it's not even close. Because, in reality, it probably looks a little bit more like this. You'll still start at the ideation concept phase. You have an idea for a game. It feels strong. It feels like it has some merit. And you start digging into it and concepting it and fleshing out maybe what the characters are going to be or what the story is going to be. Then at some point in time, you just decide, nope, that idea is not the one we want to go with. Maybe it doesn't align with, your studio's culture or the IP that you're trying to flesh out. Or maybe it just doesn't really feel strong. Maybe it doesn't feel like it's the type of story that needs to be told right now. So you scrap that idea, start all over with idea number 2, goes through concept. Now, you've sort of learned from the first idea, you've learned how to build on this, and you feel like, okay, this idea has some strength behind it. I think we can really make a game for it. So you move into the build-in or the block-in and the design phase, start building everything out, your characters, your animation, your mechanics, all that sort of stuff. And maybe halfway through that, or some part way through that, you realize it's still not working. This idea looked great on paper or in concept, but once it actually starts being realized in mechanics, it just isn't really working. So you scrap it and you go back to idea number 3 all over again. It goes back into concept. It starts, floating back and forth. It starts being really built up and goes into the design phase and the blocking phase. And you really feel like, we've learned from the last couple ideas. We know what's going to work and what doesn't. This feels like the market will really enjoy this. This feels good for the type of studio we want to be and the type of games we want to make. So let's start fleshing this out. Let's approve this. We'll greenlight it and start moving it forward. So you've blocked in levels, you've designed characters, you've started working on maybe vehicles and guns or weaponry. And you start moving into the level art and environment phase, and then the rest of the art phases like lighting, VFX, and audio. But again, if anybody's been in the production cycle before, you know that this doesn't happen in one chunk. What's more likely is you'll have multiple passes. You'll have a first pass where they block in all the level art and you design the levels and you start fleshing it out with lighting and audio. And then it starts back over and level art does a second pass on it, and builds up until you get through maybe first, second, third pass, maybe more. And, this can take years, but eventually you do get to a point where you get to QA. And maybe QA then tells you all the things you've done wrong and all the bugs you still have to fix. And so some things might have to be started all over again, because it just isn't working how it was designed and it has to go all the way back to the beginning. But after many years, after many, many nights and days working on this, preferably not nights, but many days working on this, you get to a point where your game is finished, it's functional, it runs, it's as bug-free as you're going to get it, and you pass it off to cert. And cert certifies it, says it's good to be produced and to ship out, and you finally ship that game. Now, why does the skills we're going to talk about, these sort of empathy skills or these communication skills, why does it matter for all of this? And at the bare bones of it is that flexibility is necessary. It's not just a nice to have. We saw that production cycle and it's super complicated. And VFX comes at a fairly late portion of that very complicated cycle. And so it's likely that things are going to change frequently before they ever get to you. And so being flexible and being agile and being able to kind of pivot when something changes is a necessary tool. It's not just a nice to have. And then specifically for VFX artists, I think this is even more important because VFX department and VFX artists are frequently what I consider catch-all artists or catch-all departments. We come from very different backgrounds most of the time, from UI or environments or programming, or like me, where you come from film. And so more often than not, you'll probably be asked to do things that are a little bit outside of your area of expertise, or you'll be challenged with something that, because you have a variety of background experience, isn't what you would normally work on. It's not an effect that you would normally ask, or you're being requested to make a system that you wouldn't have normally done. And so I think perhaps more than other departments, VFX has to be extra flexible. We have to be extra agile to be able to handle all the different requests that might come down to us through the pipe. And there are so many pitfalls in that complicated production that to be efficient and to make sure that we release the game on time and that it's a good game that you release, you have to be able to work together. And so when we talk about these ideas of communication, collaboration, the end goal of all that is that you just work better with your fellow peers, your other colleagues. And so to be efficient, you have to be able to do that. And then, as I've said, that process is complicated enough that your goal should be to make yourself less difficult in that process. This is the idea of having empathy for the people that you're working with. You want their lives to be good when they're making the game, and you want their job to be easier because you want your job to be easier too. And the more you can kind of help other people and work with other people well and efficiently, the more happy you're going to be in this job, and the more happy other people are going to be as well. So that's the why all this matters. So let's dig a little bit into how we're going to start, figuring this out. So there are going to be three main points that I discussed, three main sections. The first is communication. We're going to talk about communication within the VFX team, with other departments, and then a very specific example of communication, which is this idea of giving and receiving feedback. We're going to talk about collaboration, primarily with understanding when to push and when to step aside, and as well as examining what you as a developer bring to the table that makes you unique. And finally, we're going to talk about this idea of embracing failure. We're going to look at what it teaches us, why we might be afraid of it, and how we can embrace it instead. All with the goal of making us a more, empathetic and efficient artist in that crazy complicated production cycle. So, communication. For all three of these categories, communication, collaboration, and failure, I've grabbed definitions. And so for communication, I grabbed noun, a process by which information is exchanged between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, or behaviors. Now, I picked this specific definition because of this word behaviors. I think most people, when they hear communication, they think of, talking with someone or written communication like an email or a letter. But I want to dig into this idea of communication through behaviors and the behaviors that we model as, colleagues and VFX artists. And as I said, we're going to talk about it in terms of communication within your VFX team, communication within other departments around you, and specifically with regards to giving and receiving feedback. So let's dig into communication within the VFX team. Now, I acknowledge that this is probably the easier of the three sections we're going to talk about with regards to communication, mostly because you talk to these people the most. These are the colleagues that you should be working the closest with, is your fellow VFX artist. So some of these skills might be some that you already have mastered, or that you are already on the way to mastering, or they might come easier to you than things that we will talk about in the cross-disciplinary one, but there's still value in talking about that. So first and foremost, we'll talk a little bit about this idea of learning how to yes and others' ideas. Now, if you've ever taken an improv course, this might be familiar to you. And the concept of this is acknowledging someone else's idea and recognizing it and building on top of it. The more common habit that people have is to yes but ideas. And an example of this is saying like, oh yeah, that's a good idea, but how about we do this? And what that does is that invalidates the person's idea that you are responding to, and it sort of shuts down that line of communication and then diverts it into whatever you're about to say. When you yes and ideas, that is a collaborative building of ideas. You're saying like, oh yeah, that's great, and we could do this as well. And it's this exercise of taking someone else's idea and collaborating on it and bringing them along into that conversation and building up of their ideas. This is not necessarily the easiest of the skills that we're going to talk about in this section. I don't think it comes naturally to people most of the time, and it's something that you have to be intentional with when you do. But the next 4 tips that we're going to talk about will build on this so that hopefully yes-anding comes more second nature to people. Next is echoing thoughts instead of stealing them. This, for the most part, I found that this is not done intentionally, this idea of stealing others' ideas. But if you can be cognizant and empathetic to the people that are around you and make strides to acknowledge other people's ideas when you hear them instead of just repeating them, then you can form a better bond between you and that person. And what I mean when I say this is if you hear an idea in a room, then you echo that idea by acknowledging the person that says it, and then perhaps yes-anding after that. As an example, if say, hey, Karen had this great idea, and I think we could do this with it as well. That gives that person, acknowledgement for their idea, but it also still allows the communication to move forward and still allows you to collaborate with that person and work with them. Most people have probably had the experience where, you've been in a room and you've said an idea and maybe you didn't say it loud enough and it wasn't heard or it wasn't acknowledged. And 10 minutes later, someone else in the room says your same idea and suddenly they get the acknowledgement for it or they get the recognition for it. And that can be really frustrating and really demoralizing because did that person steal your idea? Are they trying to undermine you? It's not likely that they are. It's probably unintentional. But if you, as a VFX artist or just as a game developer, can model this exercise of recognizing who said the idea and then echoing it, it'll really show that 1, you're invested in the people you're listening to, and 2, that you see the people and recognize them for the work that they're doing and not just sort of taking their ideas. And you can also do this even if you're not in the same room as that person. So, and this might be more frequently how it's done, is you'll hear an idea or you'll work through an idea with someone at their desk, and then you go off to a meeting that they're not in. And when you then present that idea, add them, give them credit for that idea. Say like, hey, I was working with Jacob and we had this idea of doing this, or, Frank had this idea and I thought it was really good and I was thinking we could do this with it as well. And that gives them recognition for the work that they're doing and for the idea that they had, and shows that you care enough to acknowledge them and still want to build on that idea. So echoing thoughts really kind of goes hand in hand with this yes and idea as well. Next, this is my favorite one, is this idea of saying the silly idea, saying the dumb idea. I'm a huge proponent of this. I don't think shame is a feeling that anybody should really have all that often. And more often than not, whatever you think is a dumb idea probably isn't as dumb as you think it is. There's probably some nugget of value in there that makes your idea worthwhile, to say out loud and to kind of put yourself out there. And then hand in hand of that is to make sure you're listening to those silly ideas. Often, as I said, it's probably not as silly as, you think it is. Maybe it's just that it's not communicated super well, or it's said in a way that doesn't really make a lot of sense, or that it feels sort of silly. But if you open yourself up to listening to these ideas and stretching those yes and muscles and being willing to sort of have a conversation and communicate with your teammates, then they'll be more comfortable saying the silly ideas, and you're more likely to get tons and tons of sort of diamonds in the rough. When people are nervous about saying these, either a technique that they want to try or some feedback that they want to give, then you're never going to hear it. And you don't know whether something is a good idea until it's been said out loud. And so if you are comfortable and you model this behavior of being open to listening to the silly ideas, then more people will be comfortable saying those silly ideas. And if you are more comfortable saying those ideas and model that behavior, then more people around you would also be comfortable mirroring that behavior. And so these 2 ideas of saying the silly idea and listening to the silly idea really go hand in hand. And then finally, learn how to celebrate successes and failures. I think people are much more inclined to celebrate your successes. They're much more comfortable doing that. And it feels sort of second nature to do that. But if you can start intentionally seeking out and celebrating where people have failed, then they'll be more comfortable owning failure, And what I mean by this is it really opens up this sort of safe space. That's what you're going to be trying to build when you do this, is you want your team members to feel safe communicating ideas that maybe they didn't see to come to full realization, or they weren't able to work through entirely, or maybe they tried it and failed at it, And if you don't celebrate those sort of things, you won't ever learn from them. And what this does is, if you're more comfortable kind of celebrating when someone doesn't do something successfully, you're building this communication channel and opening it up so that they're more likely to ask for help or collaboration on something. If they know their team has their back, and if they know that their team is going to support them regardless of whether they succeed or they fail, then they're more likely to try things that they might not have tried before, and to ask for help when doing that. Especially if you can do things such as like listening to silly ideas. If you're open and you're good on collaborating and you're open to yes-anding ideas, people will feel more and more comfortable on the team, making themselves uncomfortable or making themselves vulnerable by saying silly ideas or trying things they might not succeed at. And that's what the goal of all this is that at the end of the day, if you can start, building on some of these skills, all the rest of them will come easier. And ultimately, you'll be a stronger team for it. And you don't have to do it from the top down. Yes, Andy might be the last thing you get good at. Maybe the first thing you do is just being open about saying silly ideas. Maybe you're comfortable with that sort of stuff, or you're really good at acknowledging who said a thing. And so echoing thoughts is what you get stronger at. And at the end of the day, what you'll have built is this very strong team that has a really strong bond between them because they trust each other and they feel safe with each other. Safe to try things that they might not do well, or safe to say silly ideas, all those sorts of things. Now, that was talking or communicating within your VFX department. But now let's talk about communication outside of your VFX department with other disciplines. I do want to acknowledge that this might be difficult to do, especially in this environment that we're in now, where most people are working from home. It's difficult to do this if you're in a different building, or if you have a small, team that's spread out very wide. But all the things I'm going to talk about still hold value regardless of your sort of team distribution. Some of these things might just take a little extra effort than they would otherwise if we were all in our studios working together like normal. First and foremost, I always recommend people to actually just talk to each other, ask questions, clarify things before you start working on something. And when I say talk to people, I literally mean talk to them. If you're able, go and see them at their desk, call them up on Zoom or on Teams, literally have a human-to-human conversation with that person, because you will have a much faster communication channel built when you can have an actual, human conversation with someone. We're in an environment right now, this digital age that we're in, where everybody's working from home, where it's often easier just to send a Teams message or, an email, because it's just faster to do that. But there's a lot that can be lost via, text communication. There's a lot of nuance that can be lost. There's a lot of room for misinterpretation or miscommunication. And there's really nothing that quite beats having a human conversation, that you as a person are talking with another person. And so if you can, and if the person that you are talking to is able to as well, meaning they have the time or the energy or the focus to do it, then I always encourage you to actually talk to the person that you need to talk to rather than just sending them an email. Next, check in with the teams coming before you and after you in the pipeline. This sounds sort of like of course I'm going to do that. But the more intentional you can be in this exercise and the more effort you actually put in doing this, you'll see you'll reap rewards very quickly from this. And what I mean when I say this is just talk to other departments that are coming before and after you and sort of check in with them of where you are in the pipeline. Do they need anything from you? Do you need anything from them? And opening up this channel will really, it shows empathy for them, because you want to, give them the time to work on something, or to show that you actually care about what they're working on and that you're thinking ahead. And it allows you to get to know these people will be influencing your work, or whose work you will be influencing. So, for example, if you're going to need, animation tags to apply your footsteps to, or, muzzle flashes or something like that, check in with the animation department before they get working on that character animation and say, hey, when your foot hits the ground, can you add me 2 tags so that when it gets to me, I can just easily hook them up? And so not only does this open up communication just by getting to know the people that you're going to be working with, but it also shows empathy, because you're giving them time to work on that request. You're showing respect for their time by giving them ample time to give you what you need. And so they'll be much more open to the idea of helping you get what you need, but because they can then factor it into their schedule, and they can prioritize it against their other tasks, so that by the time their work gets to you, you'll have everything you need. And this goes in the other direction as well. Check in with audio, for example, which frequently comes last in most departments, and say, hey, do you need anything from us? We have this moment, there's going to be explosions, there's going to be dust falling, there's going to be rocks collapsing. What do you need from us? And they might say oh, I just need to know what's going to be in it. I don't really need anything else, or yeah, can you make me event tags? Because I really need to be able to trigger some audio off of your rock that slams against the ground. And then that will then show them that you're thinking of them before your work gets to them, and then also allows you to have ample time to accommodate their requests. So this idea of just taking a little extra time before work begins to really check in with the departments coming around you will have an immediate result of communication between you and other disciplines. Be flexible. We've talked about this when we were looking at the example of that, the crazy typical production pipeline. But this is especially true when talking with and communicating, I should say, with other departments. There will always come times when things change around you, both before and after in the production pipeline. And maybe somebody in a different department has to change how they've done something, or there's somebody new that's on the team and they don't communicate the same way with you. And so being flexible in your approaches and how you maybe decide how to request things, or how you approach people, or how you talk to people, all these things will make you a better artist to work around. If you have empathy for the people around you, then you can be flexible to accommodate last minute requests, or accommodate feedback that you weren't expecting, or to accommodate changes that other people weren't expecting either, but then suddenly have a trickle down effect. This idea of being flexible, like we've said before, is a necessity. And the more you can kind of model this behavior, being agile and being patient, the more people will really come to appreciate it. And on that point, the more of these skills that you can build, the more your colleagues will trust and rely on you. For example, I'm really comfortable asking people questions. It's not something that I've ever really struggled with. I don't mind talking to people I've never met before. I don't mind, asking for names and introducing myself to people. And so I've made it really clear that if someone has an issue and they bring it to me, I'm happy to help them find an answer for it. Either I might know where that answer is, or that solution is, or I'll know the person that I need to talk to get that. And so by modeling these skills and modeling these behaviors, your colleagues will remember that, and they'll come to trust on you. And likely they'll model them in turn. They'll mirror the empathy you show to them for you. And ultimately, all of this is just to make sure that, your time making this game as a game dev artist is as enjoyable as it can be, and that you are making other people's jobs as, easy and efficient as you can. So last section that we're going to talk about is feedback. And this is a very specific example of, communication. And a great way to think about feedback, and this is how it was explained to me by one of my art directors, is if you think about feedback as a conversation between two people, or multiple people. It isn't just someone giving you a bulleted list and then walking away. It should be a conversation between you and the person you are either giving feedback to or receiving feedback from. So let's talk a little bit about skills that you can build to make that better. Let's look first at giving feedback. Now, everybody has probably met someone who is not very good at either of these, giving or receiving feedback. But if you want to make yourself a better feedback giver, one of the first things that you can do is being mindful of where people are coming from. Now, this includes things such as their background, their native language, their experience, and their culture. And what this means is taking a step back before you start giving someone feedback and thinking about them as a person and having empathy for them and putting yourself in their shoes. Is their background different than yours? Do they come from a programming or technical background while you're more art-focused background? Is their native language different than yours? Is their culture different than yours? Being mindful of where a person comes from and their experience can really dictate your approaches to how you might choose to give them feedback. And simultaneously, once you're mindful of where people are coming from, this will really inform, your approaches. It'll make you be more flexible in your approaches to giving feedback. So primarily, you'll probably be given verbal feedback more often than not. You'll be having a conversation at someone's desk or, over a video call or something where you're just talking with the other person. And this can be a very useful means of feedback because, as we've talked about, I recommend always talking to a person as much as you can. But if you think about it from the person that you're giving feedback to, some things might come to mind. So they are presenting work to you that they are trying to get feedback on while simultaneously trying to listen to the feedback you're giving them. Memorize that feedback, maybe prioritize that feedback, and still converse and, collaborate within that conversation that you're having about feedback. And then if you think, maybe if they have a different native language than you, then they're also trying to translate the feedback that you're giving them and still trying to remember it and all this different stuff. And so verbal feedback can be very, very important to have that conversation, but it might not be the only type of feedback that you give to a person. You might have to then follow it up with written feedback. Either maybe someone is there taking notes for the group, or you send an email afterwards just saying like, hey, these were the main pieces that I think needed to be worked on. Everything else was pretty good, but this is like prioritized list of what I want worked on. And that really helps the person, for one, just know what is important, to then clarify maybe, if there was some misunderstanding between the communication that was given or the feedback that was given. And also sort of like a hard receipt of feedback so that they can always go back as they're working on something and, go through the list and check off things that were completed. And then you might also have to then follow that up with supporting visuals. So this might be something like taking a screen grab of a video that you're, looking at, or if you're trying to give feedback on color or, lighting in a scene, then you might need to do a paint over where you just grab a snip and pull it into Photoshop and then paint over it really quickly to give more direct feedback. Because there's certain information that doesn't communicate super well, or that some people have trouble understanding just any verbal or written feedback. And so having a visual feedback to help support that, or having a visual element to help support that, can really go a long way to making your feedback understandable. And then finally, if all else fails, then go back and think about why they might be struggling. Go back to step one and be mindful of where those people are coming from. For example, I was giving feedback to someone one time and we were at their desk and I could just sort of tell they weren't, getting it. They would nod along and they would say that, yes, they were understanding, but it just was clear that it wasn't really, translating or getting through super well. And I realized it was a translation thing. It was that their native language is French, mine is English, and I was using words and turn of phrases that just didn't really compute for them. It didn't translate well for them. And on top of that, they were trying to translate my English feedback, my quick speaking English feedback, into understandable French feedback. And there was just a disconnect there. And so I had to make sure to follow up with written feedback. And I went ahead and did just a quick bulleted list. It took me about 5 minutes after the talk, or we would just confirm it there in person, and I would give them time to sort of write notes after the fact. But just making sure that they had a secondary mode of feedback really helped them understand what we were talking about. And these can be all different things. You could talk to people and come to find that they have cognitive differences, or maybe there's a cultural difference in communication. People talk differently all over the world. And so, or they have, different experience level than you. Maybe they're really junior, or maybe they're very senior. And so that might change how you talk to another person. And so if all else fails, if this verbal, written, or supporting feedback, visuals feedback doesn't seem to be clicking, then just take a moment to, have empathy for that person that you're working with, and go back and think about where they are and put yourself in their shoes and think about how they might be getting your feedback. And then on that point, some tips for receiving feedback. At any one time in your career, you will probably be on both ends of the spectrum you'll be giving feedback and, at different times receiving feedback. And the one piece of advice that I kind of try and hammer in, and it's a difficult one, is just to not take feedback personally. If you can remove yourself and your value for yourself from the feedback that you're being given, it'll really go a long way to sort of your career and your happiness in that career. And you as an artist have been hired to do a job, and you are valuable. And when you're given feedback on something that you've done, it's not because you as a person have failed or that there is something wrong with you as an artist. It's just because the work that you have created doesn't align with the expectation or the desires of the person that you're getting feedback from. So there's nothing really personal there. It's just a mismatch of expectations. And so if you can remove yourself from it, it's better in the long run. And this is especially important because sometimes it will be personal. Sometimes the thing that person says will feel like a personal slight or personal dig. It'll feel maybe rude or offensive. And when you can remove yourself from, you remove your value from the feedback that you're being given, you can take a moment, and it's a little bit easier to step back and try and understand why that feedback was given to you the way it was. So maybe the person is just having a bad day. That's usually what the issue is. Because more often than not, most people aren't trying to put you down or belittle you or anything like that. So maybe that person is having a bad day. Maybe there's someone sick in their family, or they're having trouble at home, or they just, haven't slept well. They're not feeling well. Or maybe they have a cultural difference than you. Something that seems rude to you or sounds rude to you might not seem rude to them, or some habit of conversation might not be rude to them. And so having empathy for the other person and trying to put yourself in their shoes and understand where they might be coming from can really help understand why feedback was given to you the way it was. And it can help you not take it personally. And sometimes just say la vie. That's just life. Sometimes people just want what they want, and it's just your job to give it to them. You have a finite amount of energy. We have a finite amount of time in the day and time to work on a game. And so there's not every piece of feedback has to be, a long drawn out discussion, or it doesn't have to be something you even have to agree with. Sometimes you just have to do the job and give someone what they want. Occasionally it might prove to them that what they are saying isn't actually going to work. Like if you believe that their bit of feedback isn't really going to look as good as they think it is, then sometimes you just have to give it to them and they'll see it and it doesn't work. And sometimes it kind of doesn't matter. Like in the grand scheme of things, there's probably bigger battles to fight. And so sometimes that's just life, and you just have to give the people what they want. Next, definitely ask for clarity. As we've said before, feedback is a conversation. It shouldn't just be a one-way sort of thing. And if you're unsure about some sort of feedback that you're given, in the long run, it's better if you ask for clarity. At its very basics, you shouldn't be afraid to get what you need from someone. They want you to do something, and you want to do that something. And so if you're left unsure of the feedback or unclear on the feedback, then you're just wasting both your time and theirs. And at the end of the day, it might just help that other person build their skills as well, their feedback giving skills. For example, if they're giving you feedback that's too vague or doesn't make a lot of sense, and you tell them that and you say, hey, I don't understand what you mean when you say that this, explosion is too whimsical, then they might realize that they have to change how they're giving feedback as well. Or, if you say like, hey, you use this terminology that I've never heard before, or that I don't think translates correctly. Can you, elaborate or go over it again? And it'll help them understand that that there's a divide between their feedback and what you are receiving. And it'll help them be better feedback givers. And then finally, don't be afraid to yes and ideas. We talked about this when we were talking about communication within the VFX team. And this is the idea of building on other people's ideas and their feedback. Obviously, this is dependent on where you are in the project. If you're, super late in the production pipeline, or, people are behind, it might not be the best idea to start yes-anding ideas. But the more you can build off of others' ideas and the feedback that you're being given, the more it shows investment and it shows initiatives. It shows that you care about what you're working on and that you care to give this other person what they want to see. And it, like we said before, it opens up these channels of communication and collaboration. So that was feedback, and that was communication as a whole. So now let's dig into collaboration. And we've seen a lot of these sort of overlap with each other. We've seen communication build collaboration, and we've talked about how collaboration can build communication. But let's dig into collaboration specifically a little bit. As before, I have a definition for it. Collaborate, which is a verb. And I picked this one sort of to be cheeky, but it's to cooperate with or willingly assist an enemy of one's country, especially an occupying force. Now, I picked this one because, as anybody who's been in a full production pipeline, there will always come a time where your coworkers feel like the enemy, where either you're behind on your work or they're behind on theirs, or something is changing higher up in the pipeline and people are stressed. And when someone comes and asks you for something or requests something or is looking for help, they feel like the enemy and they feel like they're just using up your time, the time that is already short because of, being late in the production pipeline or whatever. And so this idea of building skills to collaborate means that you'll be able to cooperate with these people even when frustrations are high, when stress is high, and everyone feels like the enemy. So how are we going to do this? What are some things that we can start thinking about to do intentionally to build collaboration? First, we're going to talk a little bit about knowing when to push and when to step aside. And then we're going to talk about looking at yourself and figuring out what you as a unique individual bring to the table beyond your ability to complete your VFX task. So let's look first at knowing when to push and when to step aside. And primarily, if you truly believe in something, you should make your voice heard. If you have an idea and you believe in it, or you feel strongly in a piece of feedback, or, you think you have a solution to a problem that's really important, make your voice heard, make yourself heard. The things I talk about now, especially in the section of when to step aside, it isn't just an exercise in being a pushover. That's not what I'm encouraging. And so if you do truly believe in something, you should make that voice heard and you should stand behind it. What this does mean is that if you do have that strong idea, you might need to prove it first. You might have to do a little extra work to get people on board, or to prove that your idea has merit or that it can stand up and it's viable. And this might just require a little extra work to do that and put behind it. But again, if you do feel strongly about something, then that might require that, and you might be okay and have the energy to do that. And finally, if you do see a problem, come with a solution. There's really nothing more frustrating than being in a meeting where someone comes and just drops a whole bunch of problems that they've seen on the table and kind of wipes their hands of it and walks out. If you do see a problem, don't be that person. Definitely try and come with a solution. This might mean that you have to go and talk to people that you might not know, and see if maybe they know about the problem or if they have a solution in mind for it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be the one to solve that problem or that you have to be the one to come up with a solution. But if you see a problem, you should come with the mindset that you want to solve it together, that you want to collaborate with people to solve that problem, as opposed to just shunting that problem onto somebody else and letting someone else deal with it. That's not collaboration. That's just an errand for someone else to do. And so if you do see a problem, try and come with a solution. This also can mean encouraging or being open to solutions, like, that means if you bring a problem to someone, then you can ask them like, hey, do you have an idea for this? Or, I think this might work. I think I have a solution to this, but you're more knowledgeable in this. What do you think? It's encouraging other people to collaborate with you as well, not just a one-way sort of directional thing. Now, you can't always be pushing, you can't always be, forcing your ideas or defending them or, fighting for them. There will be times when you have to learn how to step aside. And first one is this idea of knowing when you're fighting a losing battle. This is also known as it's this idea of, is this the hill I'm going to die on? Meaning, is this the fight that I want to use my energy for? Is this the thing I really want to defend? And as we saw before, if you do truly believe in it, then yeah, maybe the answer is yes, I do really need to stand up for this and I do stand behind it and want to push for it. But there's probably more likely most of the time it's not. You're like willing to let something go, and willing to kind of like, all right, I don't really have the energy for this, and recognizing when you have a finite amount of energy and recognizing when other people might not need you to be the one that's always pushing for something, then you get more comfortable kind of letting things go. This is in line with that c'est la vie thing that we talked about with feedback of like, sometimes people just want something how they want it and you're just there to give it to them. And that's this idea is like, not every piece of feedback needs to be something you have to defend or fight against or push against. Sometimes you can just be like, okay, and move on from it because you're going to have bigger battles to fight later on. Understand that your voice isn't always the most important in the room. This could be that you're in a big meeting room where, other people are discussing things and your idea or your voice might just derail that conversation. Or maybe you do have an idea and it is important, but it's better saved for a smaller group or a more private conversation, maybe with your lead or a colleague. You don't always need to be the one that's talking in the room. Sometimes you just need to be there to listen and absorb information that's being passed around or ideas that are being passed around. And then simultaneously, sometimes you're not there to speak for yourself. Maybe you're there to lift others up instead. This goes back to what we were talking about with echoing ideas instead of stealing them. You might be in a room where there's underrepresented people or new people or people that are being talked over. And so sometimes it's your job to listen and to uplift other voices in the room and give them a sort of platform and a chance to talk and to say their ideas. And then finally, and this is the hill I'll die on, is you can't always reinvent the wheel, even if that wheel is broken. More often than not, you'll probably come across a system or a technique or an effect that was built a certain way that wasn't terribly efficient, or that there is a better way of doing it. And you just can't always fix it. Sometimes you just have to accept a thing as it is and work with it as it is, because maybe there's not time to fix it, or by fixing it, you're going to introduce other issues. There's lots and lots of reasons as to why you might just have to accept a thing as it is and continue to like grow with it and learn how to work with it in the production pipeline. And this is a test to ego for sure. Even if you do know how to make something more efficient and better, it just maybe isn't the place for that idea or there isn't time for that. And so even if you do know how to make it better, it might not be worth, the energy to do it or the possible knock-on side effects of doing it. So this is talking about when to push and when to step aside. Let's talk a little bit now about what you as an artist bring to the table. What makes you unique and what do you bring that other people might not be able to? Essentially, what makes you you? At its core, you and your experiences hold value. And no one is going to be exactly like you. No one is going to have the exact same life that you've lived. No one's going to have the same exact skills that you have. And all these skills that have nothing to do with your ability to make a VFX or a visual effect or to work in your industry still hold value in your job. So think about what you can do that other people either can't do or might not be as skilled at doing. For example, are you a great explainer? Do you stay calm under pressure? Are you good at making people laugh? Do you have strong empathy skills? All these sort of things, if you can sort of look at yourself and what you are good at as a person that, outside of your job role, when you build on those strengths, you broaden your opportunities for collaboration. So for example, if you're really good at making people laugh, this has nothing to do with making a VFX, this has nothing to do with making an explosion or making rain drip or anything like that. But if you get into a room that's super tense because multiple departments are at heads with each other, and you're really good at kind of adding levity to a tense situation, you can then open doors that maybe have been previously closed because of frustrations. You've made collaboration easier. If you're really good at explaining ideas, maybe you're the voice. If you collaborate with somebody on something and you're the one that explains that idea, obviously giving credit where credit is due, but if you can concisely explain what you're thinking and can convince people and get buy-in from people, that's a skill that has nothing really to do with making any visual effects, but it does make you a better artist and a really good dev to work with. And the same goes for all the others. It's like if you're good at staying calm under pressure, or if you're good at having empathy skills, or kind of any sort of thing that you're good at, if you're a good listener, or if you're really awesome at puzzles, all these things can really feed into building opportunities for collaboration that allow you to work with not just your VFX artists or your fellow VFX artists, but people in all other departments all around you. Okay, failure. So we're going to pivot just a little bit from communication and collaboration, and we're going to talk about failure. And like the others, I grabbed definitions for it. And for this one, I did failure as a noun, a state of inability to perform a normal function, a fracturing or giving way under stress. Now, I grabbed this one specifically, like I did the others, because I think more often than not, people take failure as a sense of identity, as a slight on their identity, as a label for themselves, aka I am a failure, instead of seeing it as a noun, like I have experienced failure, or I am in a state of failure. And when you can kind of invert your sort of understanding of failure and your relationship to it, it becomes a lot easier to embrace it and to be okay with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that, this idea of kind of changing your perspective on failure. And we're going to do that through 3 different techniques. First, we're going to look at what failure teaches us. Then we're going to look about why we might be afraid of it. And then we'll look at how we can embrace it instead. So first things first, what do we learn from failure? Now, this is a character sheet from Monster of the Week. I'm not going to go too much into all the other stuff on it, but there's a section down at the bottom called experience that I want to dig into a little bit. And this experience box is the same on multiple different character types in this role-playing game. But if we zoom in, what it says is whenever you roll and get a total of 6 or less, or when a move tells you to, mark an experience box. Now, in Monster of the Week, the mechanic is you roll 2 d6s and you add those numbers up. And depending on the value, you either succeed or you fail. If you're above a certain value, you succeed. If you even higher, you succeed with, like some special addition to it. But in this, if you roll 6 or less, that is considered a failure. What's really cool about this, though, is in this section, when you roll 6 or less, aka when you fail at something, you mark an experience box here. And then after you mark all 5 experience boxes, that's when you level up. So one of this cool mechanic basically shows you that to level up, the only way to level up is to fail. Now, this is different than most kind of games, tabletop or, video games or anything like that, where you defeat a monster or you fight an enemy and you gain XP from winning that fight. And after a certain amount of wins, then you level up. This one says you don't level up until you fail, and I think that's actually much more similar to what real life is like, is you learn a lot more from failing. First and foremost, you learn what not to do and what to do, but more likely you're going to learn about, 5 different things you're not supposed to do or you shouldn't do, and then maybe 5 other ways that you can succeed at what you're trying to do, depending on, the path that you've taken. And then again, even though you have failed, it doesn't mean you are a failure. You are just experiencing failure. You are experiencing a state of failure, but that doesn't actually mean that you as a person are a failure. Now, that's all well and good. Failure is still really flippin' scary sometimes. And so let's talk a little bit about why we might be afraid of this and why we might be kind of against this idea of failing. So imagine this is you down at the bottom. You know, you're very, very small, and at this moment, you're very stressed. So what is it that you are scared of with regards to failing? Maybe you're about to start something and you're scared you're not going to be able to do it, or you're in the act of failing. You know, you're actively trying something and it's not working out and you start to panic. So first and foremost, you probably are just scared that you're going to feel like an idiot, or that other people are going to think of you as an idiot. You know, this is a universal fear. I think everybody feels this way. This is empathy that we're talking about, is that everybody feels like this. But on top of that, you might also be scared that you're going to be punished for failing. You know, are you going to get fired? Are you going to get demoted? Are you going to get missed opportunities? You know, are they not going to give you tasks because they don't think you can handle it? And then hand in hand with that, are you scared of our industry? You know, if you're scared of being punished or that you're going to look like an idiot, you might be scared because that means if you get fired, you have to go back into the job pool. You know, we're in a fairly cutthroat industry where people perceive themselves as very replaceable. And so if you're scared that you're going to feel like an idiot and that you might get fired, that might be because you're really scared of having to get back into our industry and find a new job. And on top of all that, you might be scared because if you fail, it might prove that you're actually a fraud. That's what imposter syndrome is you feel as if that you're an imposter in the role that you're playing, and that at any point in time, someone's going to realize that, you know, they're going to find out that you're a fake. And so all these things can add up to making you feel like, oh my gosh, if I don't do this, if I don't succeed at this, they're going to see I'm not cut out for this, that I'm a fake, that I got this job by mistake, and then they're going to fire me, and then I have to go back in the job pool. You know, and this sort of stuff really weighs on you, and it becomes a sort of cycle of anxiety. And at the end of the day, you just burn yourself out by kind of being crushed under all this fear of failure. So how can we learn to kind of be okay with not being okay? You know, how do we switch our mentality on this and think of it differently, and be able to exist in a world where those fears still where they still happen and they still are there, but we don't let them stop us for trying to do something. So first, just remember what fear teaches you. You know, we looked at this experience marker that's in Monster of the Week, and this is actually much more, you know, aligned with what life is like, what real life is like. And it shows you that sometimes the only way to level up is to fail. You know, think of failure as a necessity, not just an option. You know, you're never going to be perfectly successful at everything. You have to fail, and you have to fail to learn and to grow. And you learn more from failing than you would just from success. As we said, you learn what not to do and what to do. So that's already twice as much as you would have just from being successful. But more likely than not, you're going to learn a whole bunch of things you shouldn't have done and a whole bunch of other ways you could succeed in the future. And then finally, just remember that just because you have failed, it doesn't mean you are a failure. Like in this experience example, like by failing, you level up, you become a better character, you know, you grow. And so you aren't a failure by failing. You are experiencing it, but you as a person are not a failure. And then challenge yourself to fail, you know, really push yourself out of your comfort zone and challenge yourself to try and fail. Like there's that story on the internet of that woman who challenged herself to get 100 rejections in a year or something like that. And she actually found she had more trouble doing that than she thought. She applied to a whole bunch of jobs that she didn't really think she was fully qualified for. And she expected to get 100 rejections easily, but it was actually more work trying to get rejected from these jobs than it was to get interviews for them. And kind of the moral of that is you're probably more qualified than you think you are, than you give yourself credit for. And so you won't ever know that until you actually challenge yourself and try to fail. Now, if you've modeled behavior that we talked about before, where you embrace or you celebrate successes and failures, and when you listen to silly ideas and support them and yes and them, then you'll be in an environment, you'll have built an environment where challenging yourself to fail isn't nearly as scary as it might have been otherwise. You know, if you know you have your team behind you that's going to support you and celebrate you, even if you don't succeed, then becomes a lot less terrifying to do. And then understand that everyone else feels this way as well. We've talked about this before, is this idea that, other people are also scared of this. Other people are also really nervous, and that you aren't alone in this, that you aren't the only one afraid of our industry, or the only one afraid of feeling like an idiot. This is what empathy is. Everybody feels this way. And then finally, if all else fails, just fake it till you make it. As we said before, you're probably not faking it as much as you think you are, but the more you tell yourself that you can succeed at something, that you can do something, the more likely you are to convince yourself that you can do it. It's that like psychology experiment or exercise where if you're standing in front of your pantry and you're looking for peanut butter and all you do is tell yourself that the peanut butter isn't there, that you don't see it, it must be misplaced, your brain will actually stop seeing it because you've convinced yourself that it isn't actually there. And so if you can do the same in reverse and tell yourself, yes, I am qualified for this. Yes, I can do this. Yes, I have the skills to do this. Then your brain will start to believe it after a while. And it's more likely that you're more qualified for it than you think, and that you can handle whatever you're about to try to do. And then, at the very, very end of this is just this fact that you've got this. It's okay to mess up. It's okay to fail. If you have a good environment around you, then it's probably safe to fail. It's safe. You'll get help if you need it. And again, at the end of the day, you aren't defined by what you can't succeed at. You are still valuable as a person, and you've got this. Now, we've talked a whole lot about a whole bunch of different things. And as we are wrapping up pretty quickly on this talk, let's just go over kind of what we've talked about already and close things out. So what did we talk about? First, we talked about this idea of building intention in the workplace, working intentionally, and specifically working with empathy for the other people around you. We did this through discussing communication, both within your team and with other disciplines. And we talked about how to build intention and work with empathy via collaboration with other people. And then we just talked about how to own and embrace failure. We discussed why we might be afraid of failure and what we can learn from it to use it to our advantage instead. Now, if you have any other questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. If I haven't answered them already, I'd be happy to answer them after the fact. And feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn if you have anything else afterwards. I'm more than happy to talk about this stuff. I'm really passionate about it, so would love to hear them. And then finally, if you are in the industry or the job market or looking to change, the coalition is hiring. We have plenty of jobs available. They change possibly every day. So just pop onto our website or hit up this coalition careers at Microsoft.com, and people will get back to you. And we'd love to hear from you and what you did. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your time. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your GDC. Bye.